The rain had not stopped since noon, and by evening, it had turned the cobblestone streets outside the Golden Swan Inn into shining black rivers. Inside, however, the dining room glowed with warm candlelight, and the smell of roasted chicken and fresh bread filled the air. It was the kind of place where wealthy travelers stopped to rest before continuing their journey to London, and tonight the room was full. At a small table near the back, half hidden by a large stone pillar, sat a young woman named Elena Marsh. She wore a simple gray dress, neatly pressed but clearly not new. Her dark hair was pulled back into a tidy bun, and her hands rested on the table in front of her, folded together as if she were trying to keep herself calm. She had been sitting there for almost an hour. Elena had come to the inn expecting to meet her aunt and uncle, who had written to her weeks ago, promising to discuss an important family matter, something about a small inheritance left by her late grandmother, and a decision that needed to be made before the end of the month. Elena had traveled 3 hours by coach to be here on time. She had worn her best dress. She had practiced what she would say. But her aunt and uncle had not come. At first, she told herself they were simply late. The roads were bad because of the rain. Perhaps their carriage had lost a wheel, or perhaps they had misunderstood the time. She ordered a cup of tea to pass the minutes, then a small bowl of soup when the tea grew cold. She kept glancing toward the door every time it opened, hoping to see their familiar faces. But each time, it was someone else. A merchant shaking rain from his coat, a group of laughing young gentlemen, a mother scolding her tired children. Never her aunt, never her uncle. Now, as the clock on the wall struck 8, Elena understood the truth. They were not coming. Perhaps they had never intended to come at all. She felt her cheeks grow warm with embarrassment. Around her, the dining room was full of well-dressed guests, women in fine silk gowns, men in tailored coats, all laughing and talking in small groups. And there she sat, alone, at a table meant for 4, with an empty chair across from her that seemed to grow larger and more obvious with every passing minute. She noticed the glances. A woman at a nearby table whispered something to her companion, her eyes flicking toward Elena for just a moment before looking away. A group of young ladies near the window giggled softly, and though Elena could not hear their words, she felt certain they were about her. The girl sitting alone, the girl who had been left waiting. Elena lifted her chin and tried to appear unbothered. She had learned, over the years, how to hide her feelings behind a calm face. Her father had once told her that pride was the one thing poverty could never take from a person, and she held on to that thought now, gripping it like a shield. Still, inside, she felt something heavier than embarrassment. She felt afraid. The inheritance mattered more than her aunt and uncle could possibly understand. Since her father's small shop had failed 2 years ago, Elena had been working as an assistant to a seamstress in town, sewing hems and stitching buttons from morning until night, for wages that barely covered her rent. Her mother had passed when Elena was 16, and her father, broken-hearted and buried in debt, had died the following winter. Since then, Elena had been entirely alone in the world, save for a few distant relatives, who rarely wrote and rarely visited. The inheritance, small as it was, could have meant the difference between struggling and surviving. It could have meant a little more food, a little less worry, perhaps even enough to start saving for a shop of her own one day. But without her aunt and uncle here to sign the necessary papers, the money would remain locked away, tied up in legal matters Elena did not fully understand. She let out a slow breath and reached for her cup of tea, though it had long gone cold. Just as she raised it to her lips, a voice, smooth, confident, and slightly amused, spoke from beside her. "You look like a woman waiting for a ship that has already sailed." Elena turned, startled, to find an older woman standing beside her table. She was perhaps 60 years old, with silver hair swept into an elegant style beneath a small feathered hat. Her gown was a deep shade of emerald green, clearly expensive, and she wore a string of pearls at her throat that caught the candlelight. Everything about her, from her posture to the confident tilt of her chin, suggested she was a woman accustomed to being obeyed. Before Elena could respond, the woman had already pulled out the empty chair across from her and sat down, as though she had been invited all along. "Forgive my boldness," the woman said, though she did not sound the least bit sorry. "But I have been watching you from across the room for the better part of 20 minutes, and I find myself very curious." Elena blinked, unsure how to respond to such directness. Forgive me, madam. But do I know you? Not yet, the woman said, with a small, knowing smile. My name is Lady Constance Whitmore. I am aunt to the Duke of Ashbourne. Elena's eyes widened slightly. Even she, who paid little attention to the affairs of the nobility, knew the name Ashbourne. It was one of the oldest and wealthiest families in the country, with an estate said to be grander than nearly anything else outside London. I am Elena Marsh, she said carefully, still unsure why a woman of such high standing would choose to sit with her. But I'm afraid I don't understand why I've interrupted your evening, Lady Constance finished for her, folding her gloved hands neatly on the table. Because, my dear, I believe you and I might be able to help one another. Elena studied the woman's face, searching for some sign of mockery or cruelty, but found none. Only a sharp, calculating intelligence, and something else, something that looked almost like desperation, carefully hidden beneath layers of composure. I don't see how I could possibly help someone like you, Elena said honestly. I am not a wealthy woman, Lady Constance. I have no connections, no title, nothing that would be of use to a family such as yours. On the contrary, Lady Constance said, leaning forward slightly, lowering her voice so that only Elena could hear. You have exactly what I need. You are unknown. Unknown? No one in society knows your face. No one knows your name. You are not part of any noble family. You have no rivals, no old grudges, no complicated history that might come back to haunt us. Lady Constance's eyes gleamed. That, my dear, makes you perfect. Elena felt a strange mixture of curiosity and unease settle in her stomach. Perfect for what, exactly? Lady Constance glanced quickly around the room, as though making certain no one was close enough to overhear. Then she leaned even closer, and in a voice barely above a whisper, she said the words that would change the course of Elena's life forever. Pretend to be my nephew's fiancée. For a moment, Elena simply stared at her, certain she had misheard. I'm sorry, what did you say? You heard me perfectly well, Lady Constance said, sitting back slightly, though her voice remained low. My nephew, Julian, the Duke of Ashbourne, is currently being pursued by a young woman named Miss Prescott. She is clever, ambitious, and utterly determined to become the next Duchess of Ashbourne, whether Julian wishes it or not. She has already begun spreading rumors, dangerous rumors, designed to trap him into a marriage he does not want. That sounds like a serious matter, Elena said slowly, but I still don't understand what it has to do with me. Because, Lady Constance said, if Julian appears to already be engaged, even for a short time, Miss Prescott's schemes will fall apart. She cannot claim him if he already belongs to someone else. And you want me to pretend to be that someone? Precisely. Elena shook her head, half in disbelief, half in amusement, despite the seriousness of the situation. Lady Constance, I appreciate that you seem to be in a difficult position, but what you're describing is impossible. I am a seamstress's assistant. I know nothing of your world, the manners, the customs, the way your kind of people speak and move and think. I would be discovered within the hour. You underestimate yourself, Lady Constance said simply. I have been watching you tonight, remember? You sat alone in a room full of strangers who whispered about you, and you did not cry, you did not run, you did not lower your eyes in shame. You held your head high and drank your tea as though nothing in the world could touch you. That, my dear, is exactly the kind of composure the role requires. Elena opened her mouth to argue further, but Lady Constance continued before she could speak. I am not asking you to do this for nothing, Elena. I will pay you, generously, for your time and your discretion. Enough to settle whatever debts or difficulties may be troubling you. I noticed your dress, though clean and neat, is not new. I noticed you eating alone at a table meant for guests who never arrived. I am not a fool, my dear. I know desperation when I see it, because I have used it myself, in different forms, many times. The words struck Elena harder than she expected. She felt a flush of shame rise in her cheeks, followed quickly by anger. Not at Lady Constance, but at her own circumstances, at the aunt and uncle who had abandoned her tonight, at the unfairness of a world where a woman could work every day of her life and still fall further behind. How much, Elena asked quietly, are you offering? Lady Constance smiled, as though she had been waiting for exactly this question. She reached into a small embroidered bag at her side and withdrew a folded piece of paper, sliding it discreetly across the table. Elena unfolded it with trembling fingers and read the number written there. Her breath caught in her throat. It was more money than she had seen in her entire life. More than enough to pay off the small debts left from her father's failed shop. More than enough to rent a proper room of her own. More than enough to begin, for the first time in years, to imagine a future that did not consist entirely of survival. This is... Elena's voice trailed off. Generous. I know, Lady Constance said. But my nephew's future is worth far more to me than money. I would pay twice this amount, if it meant protecting him from a marriage built on lies and ambition. Elena stared at the paper for a long moment, her mind racing. She thought of her small, cold room above the seamstress's shop. She thought of the long hours of sewing that left her fingers sore and her eyes tired. She thought of the aunt and uncle, who had not bothered to come tonight, who had left her sitting alone in a room full of strangers. And she thought, too, of the risk, the danger of being caught in a lie, of embarrassing herself in front of people far above her station, of perhaps even facing consequences she could not yet imagine. But desperation, as Lady Constance had rightly guessed, has a way of quieting fear. If I agree to this, Elena said slowly, choosing her words with care, I need to understand exactly what would be expected of me. How long would this arrangement last? What would I need to do? And does your nephew even know you are here, making this offer on his behalf? A flicker of something crossed Lady Constance's face, hesitation perhaps, or the faint shadow of guilt. He does not know yet, she admitted. But he will have little choice in the matter once the plan is already in motion. Julian is a good man, Elena, but stubborn, and entirely too proud to accept help even when he desperately needs it. Sometimes, those we love most must be helped, whether they ask for it or not. Elena raised an eyebrow. That sounds less like an invitation and more like a trap. Lady Constance laughed softly, the sound genuine and warm, despite everything. Perhaps it is a little of both, but I promise you this, my dear. I would never ask you to do something that would bring you true harm. Julian is difficult, yes, and proud, and perhaps a bit cold to those he does not know well. But he is not cruel. You will be safe with him. I give you my word. Elena looked down at the folded paper still resting in her hand, then back up at the woman across from her, a stranger who, in the space of 10 minutes, had gone from an unexpected interruption to something far more significant. An opportunity. A risk. Perhaps even a chance at a different kind of life, however temporary. Outside, the rain continued to fall, tapping softly against the windows of the inn, as if the whole world were waiting quietly for her answer. All right, Elena said finally, her voice steady, despite the storm of uncertainty inside her. Tell me what I need to do. Lady Constance's eyes lit up with satisfaction, and for the first time since sitting down, she looked entirely pleased with herself. Wonderful, she said, reaching across the table to gently pat Elena's hand. You have made a wise decision, my dear. Now, finish your tea. We have a duke to meet, and very little time to prepare you. Elena glanced down at her cold, forgotten cup, then back up at Lady Constance, a strange mixture of fear and excitement stirring in her chest. Whatever waited for her beyond the doors of this inn, she understood one thing with complete certainty. Her life, quiet and ordinary just an hour ago, was about to change entirely. The rain had softened to a light drizzle by the time Lady Constance led Elena out of the inn's dining room and toward a private carriage, waiting just beyond the front steps. It was a beautiful thing, black and polished, with the Ashbourne family crest painted in gold upon its door, a hawk perched upon a shield. Elena had seen such carriages before, always from a distance, always rolling past her on the street while she walked to work with her basket of mending. She had never imagined she would one day step inside one. Come along, Lady Constance said, holding the door open herself before a footman could reach it. There is no time to waste standing about in the wet. Elena climbed in, smoothing her damp skirts beneath her as she settled onto the soft velvet seat. The interior of the carriage smelled faintly of lavender and old leather, and everything about it, the polished brass fittings, the fine cushions, the small curtains tied neatly at the windows, spoke of a wealth Elena had only ever imagined from afar. Lady Constance settled across from her, arranging her skirts with practiced elegance, and rapped twice on the carriage roof. A moment later, the wheels began to turn, carrying them away from the inn and into the wet, glistening streets. Now, Lady Constance said, folding her hands in her lap. We have perhaps 20 minutes before we arrive at Ashbourne House, and there is a great deal you must understand before we get there. Elena nodded, trying to steady the nervous flutter in her chest. Please, tell me everything. My nephew, Julian, is not an easy man to know, Lady Constance began. His father, my brother, died when Julian was only 22, leaving him the title of Duke far sooner than anyone expected. He has spent the last 6 years managing the estate, the tenants, the finances, burdens that would break lesser men. He has little patience for foolishness, and even less for society's endless games of courtship and gossip. He sounds rather serious, Elena said carefully. He is, Lady Constance agreed. Too serious, if you ask me. But beneath all that seriousness, there is a good heart. He simply does not let many people see it. She paused, studying Elena for a moment, which is precisely why Miss Prescott's scheme troubles me so deeply. She has convinced half of society that Julian has already made promises to her, promises he never made. She has been seen at events claiming a closeness between them that does not exist, and worse, she has hinted at private meetings that, if believed, could force Julian's hand entirely. A gentleman's reputation, once questioned, is difficult to repair. Elena frowned. Surely people would believe the Duke's word over hers. You would think so, Lady Constance said, her voice tightening slightly. But Miss Prescott is clever. She has powerful friends, and she has spent months quietly planting seeds of doubt. If she announces an engagement before Julian can properly deny it, especially if she manages to arrange some public moment that appears to confirm her claims, the damage to his name, and to our family, could be severe. Society does not care much for truth, Elena. It cares for appearances. Elena absorbed this information carefully, turning it over in her mind. It was a strange, unfamiliar world Lady Constance was describing, one built on whispers and appearances rather than honest dealings. In her own life, among seamstresses and shopkeepers, people said what they meant and dealt with each other plainly. This world of nobility seemed far more complicated and far more dangerous. So my role, Elena said slowly, is to appear as though I am already engaged to your nephew, so that Miss Prescott's claims will seem impossible. Exactly, Lady Constance said, clearly pleased that Elena understood so quickly. You need only appear at a few important events, dinners, perhaps a ball or two, as Julian's intended. Once Miss Prescott's scheme falls apart, and she moves her attention elsewhere, as I am confident she will, our arrangement can end quietly. You will return to your own life, considerably richer, and no one will be the wiser. And if someone asks questions, Elena pressed, about my family, my past, how Julian and I supposedly met, Lady Constance smiled, clearly having anticipated this concern. We will prepare a story together, simple, believable, difficult to disprove. You are the daughter of a respectable merchant family from the countryside, recently orphaned, currently residing with a distant relation, while matters of your inheritance are settled. It is close enough to the truth that you will not stumble over the details, yet distant enough from your true circumstances that no one will easily trace it. Elena almost laughed at how easily Lady Constance had constructed a false life for her, as though rearranging furniture in a room. You've clearly thought about this a great deal. I have thought of little else for the past week, Lady Constance admitted. Desperation makes a woman resourceful. The carriage rocked gently as it turned a corner, and Elena glanced out the window to see the city give way slowly to wider streets, grander houses, and finally, tall iron gates that swung open as they approached. Beyond the gates stood a house so large it seemed almost unreal. 3 stories of pale stone, dozens of windows glowing with warm candlelight, and gardens stretching out on either side, half hidden in the evening mist. Ashbourne House, Lady Constance said simply, though Elena hardly needed the words. She had never seen anything so grand in her entire life. As the carriage rolled to a stop before the front steps, Elena felt her earlier confidence begin to waver. The reality of what she had agreed to suddenly felt far heavier than it had inside the warm, candlelit dining room of the inn. She was about to walk into the home of a duke and pretend, convincingly, to be the woman he intended to marry. If she failed, if she said the wrong thing, made the wrong gesture, revealed even a hint of her true circumstances, the consequences could be far worse than mere embarrassment. Lady Constance, Elena said quietly, as a footman moved to open the carriage door. What if your nephew refuses? What if he will not agree to any of this? Lady Constance's expression grew momentarily thoughtful, almost hesitant. Then, my dear, we shall simply have to be very convincing. Before Elena could ask what exactly that meant, the door opened, and there was no more time for questions. The inside of Ashbourne House was even more impressive than its exterior had suggested. A grand entrance hall stretched before them, its floor made of polished marble in alternating shades of cream and gray, reflecting the warm light of a massive crystal chandelier hanging above. A wide staircase curved upward along one wall, its banister carved from dark wood and polished to a brilliant shine. Portraits of stern-faced ancestors lined the walls, watching silently as Elena followed Lady Constance across the hall. A butler appeared almost instantly, an older man with neatly combed silver hair and an expression of practiced calm. "Lady Constance," he said, bowing slightly, "we were not expecting your return this evening." "Change of plans, Whitford," Lady Constance said briskly, already removing her gloves as she walked. "Is my nephew in his study?" "He is, my lady. Shall I announce you?" "No need. We will announce ourselves." Whitford's eyes flicked briefly toward Elena, curious, but far too well trained to ask questions. He simply bowed again and stepped aside, allowing them to pass. Elena followed Lady Constance down a long hallway, her heart pounding with every step. She caught glimpses of elegant rooms through open doorways, a music room with a grand piano, a library filled floor to ceiling with leather-bound books, a sitting room with tall windows overlooking the misty gardens. Everything felt impossibly far from the small, cramped room she called home. Finally, they arrived before a set of tall wooden doors. Lady Constance paused, glancing back at Elena with a look that was somewhere between reassurance and warning. "Whatever happens in the next few minutes," she said quietly, "let me do the talking at first." Julian's temper, when provoked, can be rather sharp. Before Elena could respond, Lady Constance pushed open the doors without knocking. The study inside was warm and dimly lit, illuminated mostly by a fire crackling in a large stone fireplace and a single lamp burning atop a heavy wooden desk. Bookshelves lined the walls, and the air smelled faintly of ink, leather, and burning wood. Behind the desk, a man sat bent over a stack of papers, a quill pen in hand, his dark hair slightly disheveled, as though he had been running his fingers through it in frustration. He looked up as the doors opened, and for a brief moment, Elena forgot entirely how to breathe. Julian, Duke of Ashbourne, was younger than she had expected, perhaps not much older than 30, with sharp, striking features, and eyes so dark they seemed almost black in the dim firelight. His jaw was strong, his brow furrowed in obvious irritation at the interruption, and even seated, there was something commanding about the way he held himself, as though the very room existed to serve his purpose, rather than the other way around. "Aunt Constance," he said, setting down his quill with visible impatience, "I thought you had retired for the evening." "I changed my mind," Lady Constance said breezily, stepping further into the room. "I have someone I would like you to meet." It was only then that Julian's gaze shifted to Elena, standing quietly just behind his aunt. His dark eyes moved over her briefly, taking in her simple gray dress, her damp hair, the nervous set of her shoulders, and something unreadable flickered across his expression. "And who?" he asked slowly, his voice low and edged with suspicion. "Is this?" "This," Lady Constance said, with the confident air of a woman about to deliver excellent news, "is Miss Elena Marsh, your fiancée." For a long moment, the room was utterly silent, save for the soft crackling of the fire. Then Julian rose slowly from his chair, his expression shifting from confusion to disbelief, and finally, to something far colder. "I beg your pardon?" he said quietly, though the quietness of his voice was somehow more alarming than if he had shouted. "You heard me perfectly well," Lady Constance said, entirely unbothered by his tone. "Miss Prescott has been telling all of society that you and she have an understanding. If we do not act quickly, she will force your hand into a marriage neither of us wants. I have therefore taken the liberty of arranging an alternative." "An alternative?" Julian repeated slowly, his eyes moving once more to Elena, sharper this time, more assessing. "You mean to say you have brought a stranger into my home and announced her as my fiancée, without so much as consulting me first?" "There was no time to consult you," Lady Constance said simply. "You would have refused." I am refusing now, Julian said flatly, turning fully toward his aunt, his voice rising slightly for the first time. This is absurd, Aunt Constance, even for you. I cannot simply announce an engagement to a woman I have never met, based on nothing more than your desire to outmaneuver Miss Prescott. Can you not? Lady Constance countered, entirely unmoved by his anger. Or would you prefer to find yourself trapped into marrying a woman who cares nothing for you, only for your title and your fortune? Julian's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Elena thought he might simply order them both out of the room. But something in his aunt's words seemed to strike a nerve, and instead, he turned his attention back to Elena, studying her with an intensity that made her want to look away, though she forced herself to hold his gaze. You agreed to this? He asked her directly, his voice slightly less sharp now, though no less serious. Elena swallowed hard, gathering what courage she had left. I did, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Your aunt explained the situation to me. I understand this is unconventional, and I understand you have every right to be angry. But I assure you, Your Grace, I have no interest in trapping you into anything. I am simply attempting to help, in exchange for compensation that means a great deal to me. Julian's eyes narrowed slightly, though whether from suspicion or simple surprise at her honesty, Elena could not tell. At least you are truthful about your motives, he said finally. That is more than I can say for most people who seek my company. I have no reason to pretend otherwise, Elena replied. I am not accustomed to your world, Your Grace, and I have no talent for hiding my intentions behind polite conversation. I need the money your aunt has offered. That is the whole of it. Something in her plain, unembellished honesty seemed to catch Julian off guard. He studied her for a long moment, the anger in his expression slowly giving way to something more thoughtful, more calculating. And if I refuse this ridiculous arrangement? He asked, turning back to his aunt. Then Miss Prescott will likely succeed in trapping you within the month, Lady Constance said simply. And you will spend the rest of your life married to a woman who sees you as nothing more than a title to be won. Julian was silent for a long moment, staring into the fire as though searching for some answer within its flickering light. Elena watched him carefully, sensing the internal battle taking place behind his controlled expression, pride warring with practicality, anger warring with the plain truth of his aunt's warning. Finally, he let out a slow breath and turned back to face them both. This arrangement, he said slowly, if I agree to it, would be temporary. Nothing more than a performance to discourage Miss Prescott's ambitions. Nothing more. Of course, Lady Constance said quickly, though Elena did not miss the small, satisfied smile tugging at the corner of her lips. Julian's gaze shifted once more to Elena, studying her with an expression she could not quite read, assessing, perhaps even faintly curious, though still guarded beneath layers of caution. And you understand, Miss Marsh, he said, his voice low and serious, that this arrangement requires absolute discretion. If anyone discovers the truth, that our engagement is nothing more than a performance, the consequences could be severe, for both of us. I understand, Elena said quietly. Julian studied her a moment longer, then gave a single sharp nod, as though sealing some invisible agreement. Very well, he said finally. It seems, Miss Marsh, that we are engaged. Outside, beyond the tall windows of the study, the rain had finally stopped, leaving the gardens of Ashbourne House glistening softly beneath the pale light of the moon. And as Elena stood there, facing the cold, guarded Duke who was now, at least in appearance, her intended husband, she could not shake the feeling that her carefully agreed-upon performance had already begun to feel far more complicated than she had ever anticipated. 3 days had passed since that strange, tense evening in Julian's study, and in that time, Elena's life had changed in ways she could hardly comprehend. She no longer lived in her small, cold room above the seamstress's shop. Instead, she had been moved into a guest chamber at Ashbourne House, a room larger than her entire previous lodging, with a soft four-poster bed, tall windows overlooking the gardens, and a fireplace that never seemed to run cold. At first, the luxury had felt almost suffocating. Elena was not accustomed to servants asking what she would like for breakfast, or to closets filled with gowns far finer than anything she had ever owned. But there was little time to dwell on her discomfort, for Lady Constance had wasted no time preparing her for the task ahead. Tonight, Lady Constance announced, sweeping into Elena's room without knocking, is your first true test. Elena, who had been standing before a tall mirror while a maid adjusted the sleeves of a pale blue gown, turned in surprise. Tonight? The Hartleys are hosting a dinner party, Lady Constance explained, settling into a chair near the window, as though she had all the time in the world, though her tone suggested otherwise. Lord and Lady Hartley are old friends of the family, and half of society will be in attendance, including, I am quite certain, Miss Prescott herself. Elena's stomach tightened. So soon? There is no benefit in waiting, Lady Constance said simply. The longer we delay, the more time Miss Prescott has to strengthen her claims. Tonight, you and Julian will appear together, publicly, as an engaged couple. It must be convincing. Elena turned back to the mirror, studying her reflection as the maid finished fastening the last few buttons along her back. The gown was a soft shade of blue, simple but elegant, with delicate lace along the collar and sleeves. It was, without question, the finest thing she had ever worn. And yet, staring at her own reflection, Elena felt oddly like a stranger looking back at herself, a seamstress's assistant dressed up to play a role far beyond her true station. What if I make a mistake? Elena asked quietly, her earlier confidence faltering slightly. What if I use the wrong fork, or address someone incorrectly, or— You will make mistakes, Lady Constance interrupted, though not unkindly. Everyone does, especially at first. The trick, my dear, is not to avoid mistakes entirely, but to recover from them, with such grace that no one thinks to question you further. Confidence, Elena. That is the true secret of society. Half the people in that room tonight know less than they pretend to, and they survive perfectly well, simply by acting as though they belong. Elena took a slow breath, trying to absorb the advice, though her nerves remained tightly wound. A soft knock sounded at the door, and a moment later, Julian stepped inside, dressed in a dark evening coat that fit him perfectly, his dark hair neatly combed, his expression as composed and unreadable as ever. He paused briefly upon seeing Elena, his dark eyes moving over her with an expression she could not quite decipher. You look, he began, then seemed to catch himself, clearing his throat slightly. You look appropriate for this evening. It was hardly a warm compliment, but Elena caught the faint flicker of surprise in his eyes before he composed himself once more, and something about it eased her nerves, if only slightly. Thank you, Your Grace, she said simply. We should go over the details of our story once more before we leave, Julian said, turning to his aunt. I would rather not risk contradicting one another in front of Lady Hartley's guests. A wise precaution, Lady Constance agreed, rising from her chair. Elena, remind him of the details. Elena straightened slightly, recalling the story they had carefully constructed over the past 3 days. I am the daughter of a respectable merchant family from Somerset, she recited. My parents passed 2 years ago, and I have been residing with a distant relation in London, while matters concerning my modest inheritance are settled. We met 4 months ago, at a small gathering hosted by mutual acquaintances, and grew close over several following meetings. Julian nodded slowly. And how, precisely, did I propose? Quietly, Elena said, a small, nervous smile tugging at her lips despite herself. In the gardens of this very house, during a private walk. You said very little, as befits your nature, but what you did say was sincere. For the briefest moment, something almost like amusement flickered across Julian's serious expression. You have clearly given this more thought than I have. Your aunt insisted upon a great deal of detail, Elena admitted. She would, Julian said dryly, glancing toward Lady Constance, who merely smiled in response, entirely unrepentant. The carriage ride to Hartley Manor was quiet, tension settling over the three of them like a heavy blanket. Elena sat across from Julian, her hands folded tightly in her lap, watching the city lights pass by the window as her mind raced through every detail of the story she had memorized, every possible question she might be asked, every way the evening could go wrong. You are gripping your hands rather tightly, Julian observed quietly, breaking the silence. Elena glanced down, realizing she had indeed been clutching her hands together so firmly that her knuckles had turned pale. She forced herself to relax them. Forgive me, I am not accustomed to this sort of thing. Nor am I, Julian admitted, surprising her slightly with his honesty. I have attended countless dinners and balls throughout my life, but never once have I needed to convince an entire room that I am engaged to a woman I met only 3 days ago. Despite her nerves, Elena found herself almost smiling. Perhaps we are equally unprepared then. Perhaps, Julian said, and for the first time since they had met, something in his tone softened slightly. If it helps at all, Miss Marsh, you need only follow my lead this evening. I have navigated society's games for years, even if never quite like this. Stay close to me, speak only when necessary, and allow me to redirect any questions that seem too probing. That sounds wise, Elena said. Thank you. Julian studied her for a moment longer, his dark eyes unusually thoughtful. You handled yourself well in my study 3 nights ago, he said quietly. Most people, faced with my aunt's scheming and my temper, would have fled the room entirely. You did not. I needed the money too badly to flee, Elena said honestly. Perhaps, Julian said. But I suspect it was more than that. Before Elena could respond, the carriage rolled to a gentle stop, and through the window, she saw the grand entrance of Hartley Manor rising before them, its windows glowing warmly, the sound of music and laughter already drifting faintly through the evening air. Ready? Julian asked, his hand extended toward hers. Elena looked at his hand for a moment, then took a steadying breath and placed her own within it. As ready as I shall ever be. The inside of Hartley Manor was a dazzling display of wealth and elegance, chandeliers glittering overhead, musicians playing softly in one corner, and dozens of finely dressed guests mingling throughout the grand hall, their laughter and conversation blending into a warm, constant hum. Elena felt Julian's hand tighten slightly around hers as they stepped through the entrance, and she understood the gesture for what it was, a silent reminder to remain calm, to trust him, to play her part. Your Grace, a cheerful, silver-haired woman approached almost immediately, her eyes bright with curiosity as they landed on Elena. And this must be the young lady everyone has been whispering about. Lady Hartley, Julian said smoothly, offering a slight bow. May I present Miss Elena Marsh, my fiancée? Lady Hartley's eyes widened with delight, and within moments, she had ushered them further into the hall, introducing Elena to a small crowd of curious guests who gathered eagerly around them. Elena felt her heart pounding as question after question was directed her way. Where she was from, how she and Julian had met, when the wedding might take place. But she found, to her own surprise, that the answers came more easily than she had expected, the practiced details slipping smoothly from her lips. Julian, true to his word, remained close beside her throughout, his hand occasionally resting at the small of her back, his responses smooth and confident whenever a question grew too pointed for Elena to answer comfortably. Slowly, gradually, Elena felt herself beginning to relax, the terror of the evening softening into something almost manageable. It was nearly an hour later, as Elena stood chatting politely with a group of older women about the merits of country living, that she felt the atmosphere around her shift subtly. Conversations quieted slightly, heads turned toward the entrance of the hall, and there, standing in the doorway with an expression of calm, confident amusement, stood a striking young woman in a gown of deep crimson, her golden hair perfectly arranged, her eyes immediately finding Julian across the room. Miss Prescott, Lady Hartley murmured beside Elena, her voice carrying a note of poorly hidden delight at the sudden drama unfolding in her own dining hall. Elena felt Julian tense slightly beside her, though his expression remained perfectly composed. Miss Prescott moved through the crowd with practiced grace, a bright, confident smile fixed upon her face as she approached them directly, entirely ignoring the small crowd still gathered around Elena. Julian, she said warmly, as though greeting an old, dear friend, I had heard the most curious rumor this evening. Surely it cannot be true. That depends entirely on which rumor you refer to, Julian replied evenly, his voice giving away nothing. Miss Prescott's smile widened slightly, though her eyes flicked briefly, sharply, toward Elena, assessing her with obvious skepticism. That you have become engaged, to a woman none of us have ever heard of, no less. Miss Prescott, Julian said, his voice calm but firm, allow me to introduce my fiancée, Miss Elena Marsh. For a brief moment, something flickered across Miss Prescott's carefully composed expression, surprise perhaps, or the faint beginnings of alarm, before she smoothed it away entirely, replacing it with a polite, if noticeably cool, smile. How unexpected, Miss Prescott said, extending a gloved hand toward Elena, though her grip, when Elena accepted it, felt far less friendly than her tone suggested. I confess, I had assumed the Duke's affections were engaged elsewhere entirely. It seems your assumption was mistaken, Elena replied, keeping her voice as steady and polite as she could manage.
Miss Prescott's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly, though her smile remained fixed in place.
How curious that I have never once heard your name mentioned, Miss Marsh, in all the months I have spent in his company. Perhaps, Elena said, drawing upon a calm she did not entirely feel. The Duke simply values his privacy, particularly regarding matters as important as his own heart. A ripple of soft, appreciative laughter moved through the small crowd still listening nearby, and Elena caught the faint, approving glance Julian shot her way, quick and subtle, but unmistakable. Miss Prescott's smile grew visibly tighter. Indeed, she said, her voice cool. Well, I do hope, Miss Marsh, that you understand precisely what you are stepping into. The role of Duchess carries considerable expectations. I am certain I shall manage, Elena replied evenly, with time. For a long, tense moment, the two women simply studied one another, the polite smiles on both their faces doing little to disguise the quiet battle taking place beneath the surface. Then Miss Prescott, seeming to realize she would gain nothing further from the confrontation, offered a shallow curtsy and swept away into the crowd, her golden head held high, despite the obvious sting of her retreat. As soon as she was out of earshot, Julian leaned slightly toward Elena, his voice low. That, he murmured, was very well handled. Elena let out a slow, unsteady breath, only now realizing how tightly she had been holding herself together throughout the exchange. I was terrified the entire time, she admitted quietly. You did not appear so, Julian said, and there was something in his voice, genuine admiration perhaps, or something even warmer, that Elena had not heard from him before. As the evening continued, and the immediate danger of Miss Prescott's confrontation faded into the background hum of music and conversation, Elena found herself stealing occasional glances toward Julian, studying the sharp, serious lines of his face as he spoke with other guests, wondering how a man so guarded and controlled could also possess the quiet, steady confidence that had made her feel, if only briefly, that she was not entirely alone in the strange, unfamiliar world she had so suddenly found herself thrust into. Whatever this arrangement truly was, a performance, a necessity, a temporary solution to a complicated problem, Elena could not deny that something had shifted within her that evening, subtle and quiet, yet undeniably real. The days following the Hartley dinner party settled into a strange new rhythm at Ashbourne House. Elena rose each morning to find a maid already waiting to help her dress, breakfast laid out in a small sunlit room that overlooked the eastern gardens, and Lady Constance, eager to discuss the latest gossip that had traveled through society, following their public appearance. They are all talking about you, Lady Constance announced one morning, sweeping into the breakfast room with a satisfied smile and a stack of letters in hand. Lady Hartley has written to no fewer than 3 of her closest friends, praising your composure, and Miss Prescott, I am told, left the party rather earlier than planned. Elena, seated at the table with a cup of tea warming her hands, felt a small flicker of pride at the news, though it was quickly tempered by lingering nerves. I only said what seemed reasonable at the time. That is precisely why it worked, Lady Constance said, settling into the chair beside her. You did not attempt to outshine her with wit or cleverness. You simply remained calm and honest, which made her look foolish for even trying to provoke you. Across the table, Julian looked up briefly from the newspaper he had been reading, his dark eyes flicking toward Elena with an expression that, for once, seemed almost approving. My aunt is not wrong, he said simply, before returning his attention to the paper. It was such a small comment, offered so plainly, yet Elena found herself unexpectedly pleased by it. In the 4 days since their arrangement had begun, Julian had remained largely guarded around her, polite, occasionally even kind, but always maintaining a careful distance, as though unwilling to let the performance of their engagement become anything more than exactly that, a performance. And yet, little by little, Elena had begun to notice small cracks appearing in that careful composure, the way his expression would soften, almost imperceptibly, whenever she made an observation that caught him off guard, the way he sometimes lingered a moment longer than necessary when their eyes happened to meet across a room. It was nothing significant, Nothing she could point to with any certainty, but it was there, quiet and persistent, like the first faint warmth of a fire not yet fully caught. "You have a fitting this afternoon," Lady Constance continued, glancing down at a small notebook she had produced from somewhere within her voluminous skirts. "Madame Fontaine is expecting you at 2 o'clock to begin work on several new gowns. It simply will not do for Julian's fiancée to be seen in the same 3 dresses at every event." Elena's cup paused halfway to her lips. "New gowns? Lady Constance, that is entirely unnecessary. I have perfectly serviceable—" "Nonsense," Lady Constance interrupted briskly. "You are appearing before the finest families in London. Appearances matter a great deal, Elena, whether we find that fair or not." Elena glanced toward Julian, hoping perhaps for some support, but he merely shrugged slightly, his attention still fixed on his newspaper. "It is easier simply to agree with her," he said, without looking up. "I learned that lesson many years ago." Despite herself, Elena laughed softly, a genuine, unguarded sound that seemed to surprise even her. Julian glanced up at the sound, something flickering briefly in his dark eyes, before he looked away again, though not quickly enough to hide the small, almost imperceptible smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. That afternoon, Elena found herself standing in the center of Madame Fontaine's elegant shop, surrounded by bolts of fine silk and lace, as the elderly seamstress and her assistants measured and pinned fabric around her with brisk, practiced efficiency. It was a strange experience, standing on the other side of the needle and thread, after years spent doing the measuring and pinning herself. She caught herself studying the seamstress's technique with quiet professional interest, noting small details in her stitching that she recognized from her own years of training. "You have a good eye," Madame Fontaine observed, catching Elena studying one particularly intricate seam. "Have you some experience with needlework yourself, Miss Marsh?" Elena hesitated, glancing quickly toward Lady Constance, who sat nearby, sipping tea and watching the fitting with mild interest. "A little," Elena said carefully, choosing her words to avoid revealing too much. "I have always found sewing to be rather calming." "A fine hobby for a young lady," Madame Fontaine said approvingly, returning her attention to the delicate lacework along Elena's sleeve. Entirely unaware of how close her question had come to revealing the truth Elena worked so carefully to conceal. By the time the fitting concluded, several hours later, Elena felt thoroughly exhausted, her arms sore from standing still for so long, her mind weary from the constant effort of careful, guarded conversation. As their carriage made its way back toward Ashbourne House, through the golden light of early evening, Elena allowed herself, for the first time that day, to simply relax against the soft cushions and close her eyes. "You seem tired," Lady Constance observed gently. "I had not realized how exhausting it would be," Elena admitted, constantly measuring every word before I speak it. "It becomes easier with practice," Lady Constance assured her. "Though I confess, watching you today, I found myself wondering something." Elena opened her eyes, curious. "What is that?" "Whether you have begun to enjoy Julian's company," Lady Constance said, her tone deceptively casual, "beyond the requirements of our little arrangement." Elena felt her cheeks warm slightly, and she was grateful for the dim evening light inside the carriage, which she hoped concealed the color rising in her face. "I hardly know him well enough to say," she replied carefully. "Perhaps not," Lady Constance said, though her small, knowing smile suggested she was not entirely convinced by Elena's careful denial. "Still, I have known my nephew his entire life, Elena, and I have rarely seen him laugh as easily as he did this morning, over something as small as a shared joke about my own stubbornness." Elena said nothing further, though Lady Constance's words lingered in her mind long after they returned to Ashbourne House, settling into some quiet corner of her thoughts that she was not yet ready to examine too closely. That evening, unable to sleep despite her exhaustion, Elena wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and made her way quietly down to the library, hoping to find some book that might occupy her restless mind. The house was mostly silent at this late hour, the servants long since retired, the hallways lit only by the occasional flickering candle left burning in its sconce. She had not expected to find anyone else awake. Yet there, in the library, seated in a large leather chair near the dying embers of the fireplace, sat Julian, a glass of amber liquid resting untouched on the small table beside him, a book open on his lap, though his eyes seemed fixed instead on the fire. his expression distant and thoughtful. "Forgive me," Elena said quickly, pausing in the doorway. "I did not mean to intrude. I could not sleep, and thought perhaps a book might help." Julian looked up, seeming to shake himself slightly from whatever thoughts had occupied him. "You are not intruding," he said, gesturing toward the shelves that lined the walls. "Please, the library is as much yours to use as mine, for however long our arrangement lasts." Elena hesitated a moment longer, then stepped inside, moving toward the shelves nearest the fireplace, though she found herself far more curious about Julian's quiet, contemplative mood than about any book. "You seem troubled," she said carefully, glancing toward him as she pretended to study the spines of several leather-bound volumes. Julian was quiet for a long moment, and Elena wondered if she had overstepped, if her observation had been too direct, too presumptuous, given how little time they had truly known one another. But then he spoke, his voice low and unusually thoughtful. "I was thinking of my father," he admitted. "This was his favorite chair. He used to sit here every evening, reading, long after the rest of the household had gone to sleep. I find myself drawn to it still, even now, 6 years after his passing." Elena turned fully toward him, sensing the rare vulnerability in his words. "You must have loved him very much." "I did," Julian said simply. "He taught me everything I know about managing this estate, about caring for our tenants, about the responsibilities that come with a title such as mine. But he never quite taught me how to bear the weight of it alone, once he was gone." Elena moved slowly closer, settling into the chair opposite his, drawn by the quiet honesty in his voice, so different from the guarded composure he typically maintained. "It seems a heavy burden," she said gently, "for anyone to carry." "It is," Julian admitted, "though I have grown accustomed to carrying it silently. My aunt worries over me constantly, as you have no doubt noticed, but even she does not fully understand how isolating this position can be. Everyone wants something from a duke, Miss Marsh. His money, his influence, his name attached to their own ambitions. It becomes difficult, after a time, to trust that anyone's kindness is entirely genuine." Elena considered his words carefully, understanding, perhaps for the first time, the true weight of loneliness Julian carried beneath his composed, controlled exterior. "That must be a very difficult way to live," she said quietly, always wondering. Julian's dark eyes lifted to meet hers, something unusually open in his expression. "You have not asked me for anything," he observed, "beyond the payment my aunt initially offered. I find myself curious why. Because I have no interest in your title or your fortune beyond what was already agreed upon," Elena said honestly. "I needed the money, Your Grace, that much is true, but I have no wish to take advantage of your circumstances beyond what we discussed." "Julian," he said suddenly, surprising her. "I beg your pardon?" "My name," he clarified, a faint, almost shy smile touching his lips. "If we are to continue this arrangement convincingly, perhaps it is time you called me by my given name, at least when we are alone." Elena felt a small, unexpected warmth spread through her chest at the request. "Julian," she said softly, testing the name aloud for the first time. Something shifted subtly in his expression as she spoke his name, his dark eyes lingering on hers a moment longer than strictly necessary, before he looked away, clearing his throat softly, as though to break whatever quiet tension had settled between them. "You should return to bed," he said, though his voice lacked its usual firmness. "Tomorrow brings another dinner engagement, and my aunt will undoubtedly wake you early to prepare." Elena rose slowly from her chair, understanding the quiet dismissal for what it was, not unkindness, but perhaps Julian's own careful retreat from a moment that had grown unexpectedly personal. "Good night, Julian," she said softly. "Good night, Elena," he replied, his voice quiet, almost gentle. As Elena made her way back through the darkened hallways toward her own chamber, she found herself replaying the quiet conversation over and over in her mind, turning it carefully, like a small, precious object she did not yet fully understand. She had come to Ashbourne House believing herself capable of performing a simple, temporary role, nothing more than an actress hired to play a convenient part in someone else's carefully constructed drama. But standing now outside her chamber door, her heart still unsteady from the warmth in Julian's voice as he had spoken her name, Elena understood with quiet, unsettling clarity that the lines between performance and something far more genuine had already begun, however slowly, however carefully, to blur. And she was not entirely certain, as she finally closed her eyes that night, whether that realization frightened her, or whether it was something she had, without quite meaning to, begun to hope for. A week passed at Ashbourne House, and with each passing day, Elena found the walls she had so carefully built around her heart growing thinner, more fragile, though she tried, with limited success, to convince herself otherwise. Their arrangement had settled into a comfortable pattern. Mornings were spent with Lady Constance, reviewing invitations and refining the details of their carefully constructed story. Afternoons often brought fittings, calls from curious neighbors eager to meet the Duke's mysterious new fiancé, or quiet lessons in the customs and manners of society that Elena had never before needed to know. And evenings, more often than not, found her once again in the library, sharing quiet conversation with Julian beside the fire, long after Lady Constance had retired for the night. It was during one such evening, nearly a week after their first honest conversation in that same room, that Julian set aside the papers he had been reviewing and studied Elena with an expression of quiet curiosity. "You mentioned once that sewing calms you," he said. "Madame Fontaine noticed your eye for needlework during your fitting, if I recall my aunt's account correctly." Elena glanced up from the book she had been only half reading, surprised by the observation. "You remember that?" "I remember most things," Julian said simply, "particularly when they concern you." The quiet honesty of the statement caught Elena off guard, though she tried not to let it show too plainly on her face. "It is more than a calming hobby," she admitted after a moment's hesitation. "Before my father's shop failed, I dreamed of opening my own dress shop one day. I used to sketch designs late at night, imagining the gowns I might someday create for ladies far grander than myself." "What happened to that dream?" Julian asked. Elena offered a small, rueful smile. "Reality happened, Your Grace. Dreams are difficult to sustain when one is struggling simply to keep a roof over one's head and food on the table." Julian was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes thoughtful in the firelight. "You called me Julian a week ago," he said finally, a faint note of teasing in his voice. "I had hoped we might continue that particular habit." Elena felt warmth rise in her cheeks. "Julian, then," she corrected softly. "Better," he said, and the small, genuine smile that followed made something in Elena's chest tighten pleasantly. "Tell me more of your father's shop. What did he sell?" And so, for the better part of an hour, Elena found herself speaking more openly than she had in years, of her father's small tailoring business, once modestly successful, before poor investments, and a series of unfortunate circumstances had slowly unraveled everything he had built. She spoke of her mother's gentle laughter, of quiet evenings spent as a family, before illness and grief had taken so much from her. Julian listened throughout with unusual attentiveness, asking careful, thoughtful questions, never once treating her past with the pity or condescension she had half expected from a man of his standing. "You have endured a great deal," he said quietly, once she had finished. "As have you," Elena replied gently, recalling his own admission about his father's death and the isolating burden of his title. "Perhaps," Julian agreed, "though I confess, speaking with you these past evenings has made that burden feel somewhat lighter." Elena's heart fluttered unsteadily at his words, and she found herself searching his face for some sign that he spoke merely out of politeness, some careful performance meant to strengthen their public story. But there was nothing false in his dark eyes, nothing guarded in the quiet, genuine warmth of his expression. Whatever this was between them, it was no longer entirely part of the arrangement Lady Constance had so carefully orchestrated. It was 2 days later, during a garden party hosted by one of Julian's oldest family friends, that Elena first began to sense the walls between performance and reality blurring even further, in ways she had not fully anticipated. The afternoon was warm and bright, the gardens filled with the soft hum of conversation, the delicate scent of roses drifting through the summer air. Elena walked beside Julian along a quiet garden path, slightly apart from the main gathering, her arm resting comfortably within his as they made their way toward a small, secluded fountain at the garden's edge. "You seem more at ease today," Julian observed, glancing down at her with quiet approval. "I find myself less nervous with each passing event," Elena admitted, "though I suspect that has less to do with growing skill, and more to do with growing comfort in your company." Julian's steps slowed slightly, and he turned to face her fully, an expression crossing his features that Elena had not seen from him before, something softer, more open, entirely unguarded. "Elena," he said quietly, "I must confess something to you." Her heart quickened. "What is it?" "When my aunt first proposed this ridiculous arrangement," Julian said slowly, choosing his words with obvious care, "I agreed only out of necessity, believing it nothing more than a temporary, practical solution to an inconvenient problem. I expected discomfort. I expected awkwardness. I did not expect." He paused, and Elena found herself holding her breath, waiting. "I did not expect to find myself genuinely enjoying your company," Julian finished quietly. "Nor did I expect to find myself looking forward, each evening, to our conversations in the library, far beyond what our arrangement requires." Elena's breath caught in her throat, her heart pounding rapidly against her ribs. "Julian, Before she could finish, a burst of laughter erupted from nearby, and Elena turned to see a small group of guests approaching along the path, their attention immediately drawn toward the Duke and his mysterious fiancée standing so closely together near the fountain. Julian straightened slightly, the openness in his expression retreating once more behind careful composure, though his hand remained gently at the small of her back as the group approached. "Your Grace," one of the gentlemen called cheerfully. "Miss Marsh, we were beginning to wonder if you had abandoned the party entirely." "Merely enjoying a moment of quiet," Julian replied smoothly, though Elena did not miss the faint tightness in his voice, the small, private disappointment at their interrupted moment. The remainder of the garden party passed in a pleasant, if slightly distracted haze for Elena, her mind returning again and again to Julian's unfinished confession, to the warmth in his dark eyes as he had spoken, to the aching disappointment she had felt when their conversation had been so abruptly cut short. She found herself watching him throughout the afternoon, the easy confidence with which he spoke to old friends, the quiet patience he showed toward an elderly aunt of Lord Hartley's who insisted upon recounting a lengthy story about her garden roses, the occasional glances he cast her way across the lawn, brief but unmistakably warm. It was not until much later that evening, back at Ashbourne House, that Elena finally found herself alone with Julian once more, the events of the garden party still lingering heavily in her mind. She had gone, as had become her habit, to the library after most of the household had retired, hoping perhaps that Julian might join her there, as he so often did. She was not disappointed. Barely 20 minutes after she had settled into her usual chair near the fire, the library door opened quietly, and Julian stepped inside, still dressed in his evening clothes, though he had removed his cravat, leaving his collar slightly open, in a manner far less formal than Elena had ever seen from him. "I hoped I might find you here," he said quietly, closing the door behind him. "You said something today," Elena said, unable to wait any longer, before we were interrupted. "I have thought of little else since." Julian moved slowly toward her, settling into the chair opposite her own, his dark eyes serious and unusually vulnerable in the firelight. "I meant every word," he said quietly. "Elena, when my aunt first brought you into my study, I believed you nothing more than an inconvenient stranger, thrust unwillingly into my life to solve a problem I resented deeply. I did not expect." He paused again, seeming to search for the right words, and Elena waited patiently, her heart pounding steadily in her chest. "I did not expect you," he finished simply, "to become someone I genuinely look forward to seeing each day. Someone whose honesty and quiet strength I have come to admire far more than I anticipated. Someone who, I confess, I have begun to wonder about beyond the boundaries of our arrangement." Elena felt tears prick unexpectedly at the corners of her eyes, though whether from happiness or fear, she could not entirely say. "Julian," she said softly, "I have felt something similar, though I confess I have been afraid to fully acknowledge it, even to myself. This arrangement was never meant to become anything real. I fear what might happen if we allow ourselves to forget that." "Perhaps," Julian said quietly, leaning forward slightly, his dark eyes never leaving hers. "The true danger lies not in allowing this to become real, Elena, but in pretending, for even a moment longer, that it has not already begun to." The quiet honesty of his words settled heavily, beautifully, between them, and for a long, breathless moment, neither of them spoke, the crackling fire, the only sound within the quiet library. Elena knew, with sudden, quiet clarity, that whatever careful boundaries they had both tried to maintain since the beginning of their strange arrangement, those boundaries had already begun, slowly and irreversibly, to dissolve entirely. And though the practical, cautious part of her mind still whispered warnings about the risks that lay ahead, about Miss Prescott's lingering suspicions, about the vast difference in their stations, about the very real possibility of heartbreak should this fragile, unexpected connection ultimately fail, Elena found, for the first time since sitting alone at that small table in the Golden Swan Inn, that she was no longer entirely afraid of what the future might hold. The morning after their quiet, heartfelt conversation in the library, Elena woke with a strange, unfamiliar lightness in her chest, though it was tempered almost immediately by a persistent thread of worry that she could not quite shake. Whatever had passed between herself and Julian the previous evening felt undeniably real, yet the circumstances surrounding their entire arrangement remained as precarious as ever. Their engagement, however genuine it had begun to feel in private, was still, in the eyes of society, nothing more than a carefully maintained performance, one that could unravel entirely should the wrong person ask the wrong question. That wrong person, as it happened, was already hard at work. Miss Prescott had not taken her defeat at the Hartley dinner party gracefully. In the days that followed, she had grown increasingly determined to uncover the truth behind Julian's sudden engagement, convinced that something about the entire situation did not add up. She was, after all, a woman who had spent years carefully studying the intricate web of London society, memorizing names and faces, tracking family connections and fortunes, with the same precision a general might apply to studying enemy troop movements. And Elena Marsh, despite the carefully constructed story surrounding her, was a name Miss Prescott had never once encountered before that evening. It was this nagging inconsistency that led Miss Prescott, 3 days after the garden party, to pay a visit to an old friend of hers, a woman named Mrs. Caroline Whitby, whose late husband had once done business in the textile trade and who, as a result, maintained a wide network of acquaintances among London's merchant families. "Somerset, you say?" Mrs. Whitby repeated, settling into her favorite armchair as a servant poured tea for her guest. "A merchant family, recently orphaned, with some manner of inheritance dispute?" "That is the story circulating, yes," Miss Prescott said, watching her friend carefully. "Marsh is the family name. Surely, given your late husband's connections, you might have heard something of them." Mrs. Whitby considered this for a long moment, tapping one finger thoughtfully against her teacup. "The name is not entirely unfamiliar," she admitted slowly, "though I confess, my memory is not what it once was. I believe there was a tailor by that name, some years back, though I could not say with certainty whether it is the same family. His business failed rather badly, if I recall correctly, and I believe the poor man passed away shortly afterward, leaving very little behind for his family." Miss Prescott's eyes sharpened with interest. "A failed tailor, you say? Not exactly the picture of a respectable merchant family, is it?" "Perhaps I am misremembering entirely," Mrs. Whitby said, though something in her tone suggested she believed her own recollection was likely accurate. "It has been several years since I heard the name mentioned." It was enough, however, to plant a seed of suspicion that Miss Prescott intended to nurture carefully. If Elena Marsh's background was not what she claimed, if the story of a respectable Somerset merchant family concealed something far more modest, even embarrassing, then perhaps the entire engagement was built upon a foundation of lies. And if Miss Prescott could prove as much, publicly and convincingly, she might yet salvage her own ambitions toward the Duke's title. Over the following days, Miss Prescott quietly expanded her investigation, sending careful, discreet inquiries to acquaintances throughout London, searching for anyone who might have direct knowledge of the Marsh family's true circumstances. It was slow, careful work, the kind that required patience and subtlety rather than open confrontation, and Miss Prescott, whatever her faults, possessed both qualities in abundance. Elena, meanwhile, remained entirely unaware of the quiet storm gathering around her, her attention consumed instead by the increasingly complicated feelings she harbored for Julian, and by the growing demands of her role as his supposed fiancée. Invitations continued to arrive daily at Ashbourne House, each one requiring careful preparation, and Lady Constance, delighted by the success of their public appearances thus far, had begun planning an even grander event, a ball, to be hosted at Ashbourne House itself, intended to formally announce the engagement to the whole of society. It must be perfect, Lady Constance insisted one afternoon, spreading out several sheets of paper across the drawing room table, each covered with detailed notes regarding guest lists, decorations, and menus. Every important family in London will be in attendance. This ball must leave absolutely no doubt in anyone's mind regarding the sincerity of your engagement. Elena studied the lengthy guest list with growing unease. Will Miss Prescott be invited? Unfortunately, yes, Lady Constance admitted with a slight grimace. To exclude her entirely would only invite further gossip and suspicion. Better to have her present, where we can observe her, than absent, where she might cause mischief unseen. Elena's stomach tightened at the thought of facing Miss Prescott again, particularly now that her feelings toward Julian had grown so much more complicated, so much more genuine, since their last encounter. She glanced toward Julian, who sat nearby reviewing correspondence, his expression thoughtful. "You seem concerned," he observed, catching her gaze. "I am simply aware," Elena said carefully, "that Miss Prescott is unlikely to accept defeat gracefully." "No," Julian agreed slowly. "She is not known for grace in matters of ambition. But you have handled her once already, Elena, with considerable skill. I have every confidence you shall manage again, should it prove necessary." His confidence, though reassuring, did little to fully ease the quiet unease settling in Elena's chest. She had learned enough, in her weeks within Ashbourne House, to understand that society's games could turn cruel and complicated, in ways she did not yet fully comprehend. And Miss Prescott, however polished her outward manner, possessed a sharp, calculating mind that Elena suspected should not be underestimated. Her suspicions proved entirely justified only 2 days later. Elena had gone into town that afternoon, accompanied by a maid, to visit Madame Fontaine's shop for a final fitting of the gown she intended to wear at the upcoming ball. It was a simple errand, one she had completed without incident several times already, and she thought little of it as her carriage made its way through the busy streets toward the seamstress's establishment. She did not expect to find Miss Prescott waiting for her, seated with deliberate casualness in a chair near the shop's entrance, as though she had simply happened to be passing by. "Miss Marsh," Miss Prescott said, rising smoothly as Elena entered, her smile polite but unmistakably sharp at the edges. What a fortunate coincidence. Elena's stomach tightened immediately, though she forced herself to maintain a calm, pleasant expression. "Miss Prescott, I did not expect to see you here."
"Nor I you,"
Miss Prescott replied, though something in her tone suggested the encounter was anything but accidental. "I confess, I have found myself thinking of you a great deal these past days, Miss Marsh. Your engagement to the Duke has been the talk of society, after all." "I am aware," Elena said carefully, watching Miss Prescott's expression closely, searching for some hint of the woman's true intentions. "I find myself curious," Miss Prescott continued, moving closer, her voice lowering slightly, though not so far that the words could not still easily be overheard by the seamstress's assistants nearby. "About your family, Miss Marsh. Somerset, was it? A respectable merchant family?" "That is correct," Elena said, keeping her voice steady, despite the sudden unease tightening in her chest. "How curious, then," Miss Prescott said slowly, "that I have spoken with several acquaintances who maintain extensive connections throughout Somerset's merchant community, and not a single one of them recalls any family by the name of Marsh, matching the description you have provided." Elena felt her pulse quicken, though she forced herself to remain outwardly composed. "Somerset is a large county, Miss Prescott. It seems hardly surprising that your acquaintances might not know every family residing there." "Perhaps," Miss Prescott allowed, though her sharp eyes remained fixed on Elena's face, searching for any crack in her composure. "Though I did hear a rather different story from a friend of mine, regarding a tailor named Marsh, whose business failed rather spectacularly some years ago, leaving his family with considerably reduced circumstances. I wonder, Miss Marsh, if that story bears any resemblance to your own." The words struck Elena like a blow, though she fought desperately to keep her expression neutral, her voice steady. "I cannot account for whatever rumors you may have heard, Miss Prescott. I can only speak to the truth of my own circumstances." "Of course," Miss Prescott said, her smile widening slightly, though it held no warmth whatsoever. "I am certain there is a perfectly reasonable explanation for the discrepancy. Society does so love a good mystery, however, and I confess, I have found myself unable to resist looking further into the matter." Elena's heart pounded rapidly, though she held Miss Prescott's gaze steadily. "I wonder, Miss Prescott, whether your time might be better spent focusing on matters more directly relevant to your own circumstances, rather than investigating mine." Something flickered dangerously behind Miss Prescott's carefully composed expression. "Oh, but your circumstances have become entirely relevant to mine, Miss Marsh. Ever since you appeared so conveniently to interfere with an understanding I had been carefully cultivating for quite some time. I intend to discover the truth behind your sudden, mysterious engagement, one way or another. And when I do, I assure you, I shall make certain the whole of society learns of it as well." With that, Miss Prescott offered a shallow, mocking curtsy and swept out of the shop, leaving Elena standing frozen near the entrance, her heart racing, her mind spinning with the sudden, terrifying realization that their carefully constructed story might soon collapse entirely. She completed her fitting, in a distracted haze, barely registering Madame Fontaine's cheerful chatter about the final adjustments to her ball gown, her thoughts consumed entirely by the confrontation with Miss Prescott. By the time she returned to Ashbourne House that evening, her nerves were stretched painfully thin, and she sought out Julian almost immediately, finding him once again in his study, reviewing estate documents by lamplight. "Julian," she said, closing the door behind her, her voice betraying more urgency than she had intended, "we have a serious problem." He looked up immediately, setting aside his papers, his expression sharpening with concern at the evident distress in her voice. "What has happened?" Elena recounted the confrontation with Miss Prescott as steadily as she could manage, watching Julian's expression grow increasingly troubled as she spoke. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, his jaw tight, his dark eyes thoughtful. "She has always been resourceful," he said finally, his voice low. "I had hoped we might have more time before she began investigating so thoroughly." "What do we do?" Elena asked, unable to keep the tremor of fear from her voice. "If she discovers the full truth and reveals it publicly, the consequences for you, for your family's reputation, will be significant," Julian finished quietly, though his eyes, when they met hers, held something steady and reassuring, despite the gravity of the situation. "But Elena, listen to me carefully. Whatever happens, whatever Miss Prescott chooses to reveal, I will not allow you to bear the consequences alone. This arrangement was my aunt's doing, and my own agreement, as much as it was yours. But it is my false history she has uncovered," Elena said. "My father's failure, my family's true circumstances. If that becomes public, then we shall face it together," Julian said firmly, rising from his desk and crossing the room to stand before her, his dark eyes intense and unwavering. "Elena, I meant what I said in the library. Whatever this arrangement began as, it has become something far more significant to me. I will not allow Miss Prescott's schemes to destroy that, nor will I allow her to shame you for circumstances entirely beyond your control." Elena felt tears prick unexpectedly at her eyes, moved deeply by the fierce sincerity in his voice. "I am frightened, Julian," she admitted softly, "not merely for myself, but for what this might mean for you, for your family's standing." Julian reached out, gently taking her hand within his own, his thumb tracing a slow, comforting circle across her knuckles. "We still have time before the ball," he said quietly. "Time to prepare, to consider our options carefully. Miss Prescott may suspect the truth, but suspicion alone is not proof. We shall simply need to remain steady and careful until we better understand what she truly intends." Elena nodded slowly, drawing what comfort she could from the quiet strength in his voice, though the fear lingered heavily in her chest, a persistent, unwelcome shadow settling over the fragile happiness she had only just begun to allow herself to feel. Outside the study's tall windows, the evening had grown fully dark, the stars barely visible behind a thin veil of clouds, and Elena could not shake the unsettling feeling that whatever storm Miss Prescott intended to unleash, it was approaching far more swiftly than either she or Julian were fully prepared to withstand. The days following Elena's tense encounter with Miss Prescott passed with an unsettling quiet, the kind that gathers before a storm, though the storm itself had not yet fully broken. Miss Prescott made no further public accusations, no further pointed visits to Madame Fontaine's shop, and for a time, Elena allowed herself to hope, however cautiously, that the woman's threats had been little more than an attempt at intimidation, nothing she could truly prove. But Julian, ever practical, cautioned against such hope. Miss Prescott is not the sort of woman to abandon a scheme simply because her first attempt did not yield immediate results, he warned one evening, as they sat together in the library, the fire casting long, flickering shadows across the room. I suspect her silence means only that she is gathering further evidence, preparing to strike at a moment she believes will cause the greatest possible damage. The ball, Elena said quietly, understanding immediately. Almost certainly, Julian agreed. It would be the perfect opportunity, the entire engagement publicly celebrated, before the whole of society, only to be shattered by scandal, in the very same evening. She has always possessed a flair for dramatic timing. Elena felt a familiar knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach, though she tried to push it aside. There was little to be gained from dwelling constantly on fear, and Lady Constance's preparations for the ball continued at a relentless pace, regardless of the quiet danger lurking beneath the surface of their carefully constructed engagement. It was, perhaps, this very tension, the fragile uncertainty of what lay ahead, that made the quiet moments Elena shared with Julian, in the days that followed, feel all the more precious, all the more vividly real. One such moment came on a bright, unseasonably warm afternoon, nearly a week before the ball, when Julian unexpectedly appeared at the door of the small sitting room, where Elena had taken to sketching quietly during her rare free hours. "I have finished my correspondence earlier than expected," he announced, glancing at the sketchbook resting open upon her lap. "Might I interrupt?" Elena smiled, setting aside her pencil. "You may, though I confess, my sketches are hardly anything of significance." Julian moved closer, his curiosity evidently piqued, and before Elena could stop him, he had leaned over her shoulder to study the page she had been working on. A delicate design for a gown, its lines elegant and flowing, sketched with the same careful attention to detail she had once poured into her father's small shop. "This is remarkable," he said, genuine admiration coloring his voice. "You have a true gift, Elena." "It is only a hobby," Elena said, though warmth spread through her chest at his praise. "A hobby you clearly love," Julian countered, settling into the chair beside hers, his dark eyes still lingering on the sketch. "Tell me, if circumstances were different, if you were not required to spend your days navigating society's expectations on my behalf, what would you wish to do with such talent?" Elena considered the question carefully, surprised by how easily the answer came to her. "I would open a small shop of my own," she said. "Nothing grand, not at first. Simply a place where I might design and create gowns for women who could not otherwise afford the finest seamstresses in London, yet still deserve to feel beautiful and well-made." "That does not sound like a small ambition to me," Julian said quietly. "It sounds like a rather wonderful one." Elena glanced at him, startled by the sincerity in his voice. "You truly believe so?" "I do," Julian said simply. "You possess both skill and compassion, Elena. A rare combination. I have no doubt you would succeed brilliantly, should you ever have the opportunity to pursue such a dream." The quiet conviction in his words settled warmly within Elena's chest, and for a moment, she allowed herself to imagine a future entirely different from the uncertain path she currently walked. A future where her talent might be given room to grow, unburdened by the constant fear of scandal and exposure that now shadowed her every step. "Perhaps, once our arrangement concludes," she said softly, "the money your aunt has promised might allow me to begin exactly that." Something flickered across Julian's expression at her words, a brief shadow of what looked almost like disappointment, quickly masked before Elena could be entirely certain she had seen it correctly. "Perhaps," he said, his voice carefully neutral once more. An uncomfortable silence settled briefly between them, and Elena found herself wondering, not for the first time, what exactly Julian imagined for their future, once the immediate danger of Miss Prescott's scheme had passed. Their arrangement had always been temporary by design, a practical solution to a specific problem, yet the feelings that had grown steadily between them in recent weeks felt anything but temporary. It was Julian who finally broke the silence, rising from his chair and moving toward the window, his back partially turned to her. "Elena," he said quietly, "I find myself in something of a difficult position." "What do you mean?" He turned back to face her, his dark eyes unusually uncertain. "When this arrangement began, I understood it clearly as a temporary measure, a performance designed to protect my family's reputation, nothing more. I did not anticipate the depth of feeling that has since developed between us. And now, faced with the approaching ball, and Miss Prescott's evident determination to expose our deception, I find myself questioning what, precisely, I am meant to do. Elena rose slowly from her own chair, moving closer to him, her heart pounding steadily. "What do you wish to do, Julian?" He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze searching hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I wish," he said finally, his voice low and unusually vulnerable, "for this arrangement to become something real, permanently real, Elena, not merely a performance we abandon once the danger has passed." Elena's heart leapt, though a familiar current of fear ran quickly beneath her joy. "Julian, you are the Duke of Ashbourne. I am a seamstress's assistant, the daughter of a failed tailor. Society would never—" "Society," Julian interrupted gently, "does not determine the course of my heart, Elena. I have spent 6 years dutifully managing this estate, fulfilling every expectation placed upon me since my father's death. I have earned, I believe, the right to choose my own wife, rather than allowing society's rigid expectations to choose her for me." "But the scandal," Elena pressed, though her voice trembled with something closer to hope than fear now. "If Miss Prescott reveals the truth of my background, before you have had the chance to speak openly of your intentions, the damage to your family's reputation could be severe. People will say you were deceived, manipulated, that I trapped you through lies. Then we shall simply have to ensure," Julian said, moving closer, taking her hands gently within his own, "that the truth is revealed on our own terms, rather than Miss Prescott's. Elena, I do not wish to lose you to society's judgment, nor to my own family's history of choosing duty over genuine happiness. I watched my father spend years in a marriage arranged entirely for practical reasons, a marriage that, while dutiful, was never truly happy. I do not wish to repeat his mistake." Elena's eyes filled with unexpected tears, moved deeply by the quiet sincerity in his voice, by the warmth of his hands holding hers so gently. "Julian, I care for you a great deal," she admitted softly, "more than I ever expected to, when this arrangement first began. But I am afraid of what it might cost you, should you choose to defy society's expectations for my sake. Let me worry for my own reputation," Julian said gently, reaching up to brush a stray tear from her cheek with unexpected tenderness. "You need only tell me, honestly, whether you wish for this arrangement to become something real, something lasting, or whether you would prefer we proceed exactly as originally planned, ending our connection once the immediate danger has passed." Elena searched his face carefully, finding nothing but genuine warmth and sincerity in his dark eyes. "I wish for it to become real," she whispered finally. "I have wished for that, I think, since our very first conversation in this house, though I was too frightened to fully admit it, even to myself." A slow, genuine smile spread across Julian's face, transforming his usually serious features into something softer, more open than Elena had ever seen from him. "Then we shall face whatever Miss Prescott intends together," he said quietly, "and we shall ensure, regardless of the outcome, that the truth of our feelings for one another remains entirely unshakable." For a long, quiet moment, they simply stood together near the window, the warm afternoon sunlight spilling softly across the room, the weight of their shared confession settling comfortably between them. Elena felt, for the first time since her strange journey into Julian's world had begun, a genuine sense of hope, fragile perhaps, given the uncertainty that still lay ahead, but real nonetheless. Their quiet moment was interrupted, gently, by the sound of Lady Constance's voice calling from somewhere down the hallway, drawing steadily closer. "Elena, Julian, wherever have you both disappeared to? We have final preparations to discuss before the ball." Julian's smile widened slightly, and he squeezed Elena's hands gently before releasing them, though his dark eyes remained warm, steady, with quiet affection. "We should join her," he said softly, "before she grows suspicious of our absence." "Julian," Elena said quickly, before he could turn away, "whatever happens at the ball, whatever Miss Prescott attempts to reveal, I want you to know that these past weeks with you, however complicated, have been the happiest of my life since my parents passed." Something tender flickered across Julian's expression at her words, and he reached out one final time, gently cupping her cheek within his palm. "And you, Elena," he said softly, have reminded me that duty and happiness need not always exist as separate, competing forces. For that, I am deeply grateful. As they finally made their way toward the hallway, toward Lady Constance's impatient calling and the countless preparations still required before the ball, Elena felt a renewed sense of determination settle steadily within her chest. Whatever Miss Prescott intended, whatever danger the coming days might bring, she no longer faced it alone, nor entirely afraid. She faced it, instead, with Julian steadily beside her, and with the fragile, precious hope that whatever storm awaited them at the ball, their newly acknowledged feelings for one another might prove strong enough to weather it. The final days before the ball passed in a whirlwind of preparation, though beneath the surface of flower arrangements and menu selections, a quiet tension continued to build, tightening with each passing hour. Elena tried, as best she could, to focus on the practical matters at hand, the final fitting of her gown, the careful arrangement of her hair, the countless small details Lady Constance insisted must be perfect for such an important evening. Yet no matter how diligently she occupied herself, thoughts of Miss Prescott's threats lingered constantly at the edges of her mind, a persistent shadow she could not fully escape. 2 days before the ball, that shadow finally began to take a more concrete, alarming shape. Elena had gone into town that morning, accompanied once again by her maid, to collect a small package of ribbon and lace that Madame Fontaine had promised for the final touches on her ball gown. As their carriage made its way back toward Ashbourne House, Elena noticed a young boy running alongside the street, waving a folded paper in his hand, calling out something she could not quite make out through the carriage window. It was only once they arrived back at Ashbourne House, and Elena stepped down from the carriage, that she understood the boy's urgent message. Whitford, the butler, met her at the entrance, his usually composed expression tight with concern. "Miss Marsh," he said quickly, "Lady Constance has been asking for you most urgently. She is in the drawing room with His Grace." Elena's stomach dropped immediately, sensing at once that something serious had occurred. She hurried through the entrance hall, her heart pounding, and found Julian and Lady Constance standing together near the fireplace, both their expressions grave. Julian held a folded newspaper in his hand, his knuckles white where he gripped the pages tightly. "What has happened?" Elena asked, closing the drawing room door behind her. Julian turned to face her, and without a word, handed her the newspaper, his dark eyes filled with barely controlled anger. Elena took it with trembling hands, scanning the page quickly until her eyes landed upon a small, carefully worded column near the bottom of the society pages. Her breath caught in her throat as she read. The column did not name her outright, nor did it make any direct accusation. Instead, it spoke, in carefully vague but unmistakably pointed language, of certain questions surrounding the background of a young lady recently introduced into society as the intended bride of a prominent duke. It hinted, with deliberate ambiguity, at inconsistencies in her supposed family history, at a curious absence of any record matching her claimed origins, and closed with a promise that further details might soon come to light, should certain parties choose to speak more openly. "This is her doing," Elena said quietly, her voice trembling slightly as she lowered the paper. "Miss Prescott." "Undoubtedly," Julian said, his jaw tight with controlled fury. "Though she has been clever enough to avoid naming you directly, likely to protect herself should her claims prove impossible to substantiate. Still, the implication is clear enough to anyone who has been following the gossip surrounding our engagement." Lady Constance, who had remained uncharacteristically silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke, her voice tighter than Elena had ever heard it. "This is precisely the kind of situation I hoped desperately to avoid. If this column has already reached print, I fear it will not be the last. Miss Prescott has clearly decided to escalate matters rather than abandon her scheme entirely." "What do we do?" Elena asked, looking between Julian and his aunt, fear tightening steadily in her chest. Julian was quiet for a long moment, his expression thoughtful despite the evident anger still simmering beneath his composed exterior. "We have 2 days before the ball," he said finally. 2 days in which Miss Prescott will undoubtedly continue gathering whatever proof she believes she has uncovered, preparing to reveal it as publicly and damagingly as possible. "Perhaps," Lady Constance suggested carefully, "it would be wiser to postpone the ball entirely. Give ourselves more time to prepare a proper response, or to allow this particular rumor to fade before it grows any larger." No, Julian said firmly, shaking his head. Postponing now would only confirm, in the eyes of society, that we have something to hide. We must proceed as planned and face whatever Miss Prescott intends directly, rather than retreating in apparent fear. Elena felt a fresh wave of anxiety wash over her at his words, though she understood, even through her fear, the wisdom in his reasoning. To retreat now would only strengthen suspicion, confirm doubts that might otherwise remain merely rumor and speculation. There is something else we must consider, Elena said slowly, an idea beginning to take shape in her mind, though it frightened her considerably to voice it aloud. What if, rather than waiting for Miss Prescott to reveal the truth on her own terms, we simply reveal a version of it ourselves, before she has the chance? Both Julian and Lady Constance turned to look at her with evident surprise. Explain, Julian said carefully. Miss Prescott intends to expose my true background as though it were something shameful, something meant to humiliate me and undermine the legitimacy of our engagement, Elena continued, her voice growing steadier as the idea solidified further in her mind. But what if instead, we simply acknowledge the truth openly, before she has the chance to frame it so damagingly? My father's shop failed, yes, and I have worked as a seamstress's assistant to support myself since his passing. But there is no true shame in honest work, nor in overcoming difficult circumstances through perseverance. If we present the truth ourselves, honestly and without apology, Miss Prescott's planned exposure loses much of its power to wound us. Julian studied her carefully, something like admiration, slowly replacing the tension in his expression. You would be willing to reveal your true circumstances publicly, knowing how society often judges such things harshly? I would rather control the truth myself, Elena said firmly, than allow Miss Prescott to twist it into a weapon against us both. Lady Constance, who had been listening thoughtfully throughout, finally nodded slowly. It is a bold strategy, she admitted, but perhaps not an unwise one. Society respects honesty, particularly when delivered with confidence and dignity, far more than it respects secrets uncovered through scandal and gossip. If Elena's true history is revealed by her own choice, spoken plainly and without shame, it removes much of the sting Miss Prescott hopes to inflict. Julian moved closer to Elena, taking her hands gently within his own. Are you certain, Elena? Once revealed, this truth cannot be taken back. Society's judgment, once formed, is not always easily reversed. Elena met his gaze steadily, drawing strength from the quiet warmth and support she found there. I have spent most of my life, ashamed of circumstances, entirely beyond my control, she said softly. My father's failure, our subsequent poverty, the hard work I have done simply to survive. I am tired, Julian, of allowing that shame to control me. If society chooses to judge me harshly for honest struggle and honest work, then perhaps that judgment says a great deal more about society than it does about me. Julian's expression softened further, genuine admiration evident in his dark eyes. Then we shall proceed exactly as you suggest, he said quietly. Together. Over the following 2 days, the three of them worked carefully to prepare for what lay ahead. Lady Constance drafted careful language for Julian to use, should the matter arise publicly at the ball, emphasizing Elena's resilience and character, rather than dwelling on the hardships themselves. Julian, meanwhile, quietly informed several of his closest, most trusted friends within society of the true circumstances, hoping to build a foundation of support before Miss Prescott could spread her version of events any further. Elena, for her part, spent long hours in quiet reflection, gathering her courage for what she now understood would be perhaps the most difficult evening of her entire life. She thought often of her father, of the quiet dignity with which he had faced his own failures, never once allowing bitterness to consume him entirely, despite everything he had lost. She thought of her mother's gentle strength, of the many small sacrifices she had made throughout Elena's childhood, without ever once complaining of the burden. If they could face their hardships with such quiet dignity, Elena told herself firmly, then surely she could find the courage to face one evening of society's judgment, particularly with Julian steadily beside her. The evening before the ball, Elena found herself once again in the library with Julian, the familiar comfort of their quiet conversations, offering a welcome refuge from the mounting tension elsewhere in the house. Are you frightened? Julian asked quietly, watching her carefully across the small space between their chairs. Terrified, Elena admitted honestly, but also, strangely, more certain than I have felt in weeks. Whatever happens tomorrow evening, at least the truth will finally be spoken honestly, rather than hidden away in careful lies. Julian reached across the space between them, taking her hand gently within his own. Whatever society chooses to say tomorrow evening, he said softly, know that my feelings for you remain entirely unchanged. You are not defined by your family's misfortune, Elena, nor by the honest work you have done to survive it. You are defined by your courage, your kindness, and your remarkable strength of character, qualities I have come to admire more deeply than I ever anticipated when this arrangement first began. Elena felt tears prick gently at her eyes, moved deeply by the quiet sincerity in his voice. Thank you, Julian, she whispered, for believing in me, even now. Always, Julian said simply, and in the warm, flickering firelight of the library, Elena allowed herself, if only briefly, to set aside her fear entirely, drawing comfort, instead, from the steady, unwavering warmth of his presence beside her. Tomorrow would bring whatever challenges Miss Prescott intended, whatever judgment society chose to render. But tonight, at least, Elena felt entirely certain of one thing. Whatever storm awaited them, she would not face it alone. The night of the ball arrived with a clear sky and a soft, silver moon hanging over the gardens of Ashbourne House, as though even the heavens had decided to lend their quiet blessing to whatever the evening might bring. Elena stood before the tall mirror in her chamber, dressed in the pale gold gown Madame Fontaine had so carefully crafted for this very occasion, and studied her own reflection with a steadiness that surprised even her. She did not look like a woman preparing to face humiliation. She looked, instead, like a woman prepared to speak the truth. By the time she descended the grand staircase to join Julian at the entrance of the ballroom, the house was already filled with the warm hum of music and conversation, candlelight glittering across polished floors and crystal chandeliers, the air rich with the scent of roses arranged throughout the hall. Julian waited for her at the bottom of the stairs, dressed in a dark evening coat, his dark eyes lighting with quiet admiration as she approached. You look magnificent, he murmured, offering his arm. I feel steadier than I expected, Elena admitted softly, taking his arm and drawing strength from his steady presence beside her. The evening unfolded much as their previous appearances together had. Introductions, polite conversation, careful navigation of society's watchful eyes. But beneath the surface, Elena could feel the tension building, could sense Miss Prescott's presence somewhere within the crowded ballroom, waiting for precisely the right moment to strike. That moment came just after midnight, as the orchestra paused between dances, and Lord Hartley called for a brief toast in honor of the newly announced engagement. It was then that Miss Prescott stepped forward from the crowd, her golden gown catching the candlelight, her voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet ballroom. Before we raise our glasses, she announced, her tone sweetly poisonous, perhaps the room deserves to know a little more about the woman we are meant to celebrate tonight. A ripple of startled murmurs moved through the crowd, and Elena felt her heart pound violently against her ribs. But she did not falter. Instead, she stepped forward herself, meeting Miss Prescott's gaze directly, her voice steady and clear. Miss Prescott has been kind enough to take an unusual interest in my family history, Elena said, loudly enough for the gathered guests to hear. So allow me to save her the trouble of revealing it herself. My father was a tailor, not a merchant of grand fortune. His shop failed several years ago, and he passed away shortly afterward, leaving me with very little beyond his memory and his lessons in honest work. Since then, I have supported myself as a seamstress's assistant, stitching hems and mending gowns for wages that barely covered my rent. A hush fell over the ballroom, guests exchanging startled, uncertain glances, unsure how to respond to such open, unashamed honesty. I share this not out of shame, Elena continued, her voice growing steadier with each word, but because I have learned, through considerable hardship, that honest work and quiet perseverance are nothing to hide from. If Miss Prescott hoped to humiliate me tonight by revealing the truth of my circumstances, I am afraid she has been disappointed. I am not ashamed of who I am, nor of the path that led me here. For a long, breathless moment, the ballroom remained utterly silent. Then, unexpectedly, Julian stepped forward to stand beside her, his voice carrying with quiet, unmistakable conviction. I have known the truth of Elena's circumstances for some time, he said, addressing the gathered crowd directly. And I can tell you, without hesitation, that I have never admired anyone more deeply than I admire her, precisely because of the strength and grace with which she has faced every hardship placed before her. Title and fortune are easily inherited. Character, however, must be earned. Elena has earned hers many times over. A soft murmur of approval began moving through parts of the crowd, and Elena caught sight of several guests nodding thoughtfully, their earlier uncertainty softening into something closer to respect. Miss Prescott, standing rigid near the center of the room, seemed to realize, with growing alarm, that her carefully planned humiliation had failed entirely to achieve its intended effect. "You cannot possibly mean to marry her," Miss Prescott said, her composure finally beginning to crack. "A duke, marrying a common seamstress, society will never accept such a match." "Then society," Julian said calmly, "shall simply have to adjust its expectations. For I have made my choice, Miss Prescott, and it is not one I intend to reconsider, regardless of whatever objections you or anyone else might raise." Miss Prescott opened her mouth as though to argue further, but seeing the resolute expressions surrounding her, Julian's quiet determination, the growing murmur of approval from the crowd, Lady Constance's satisfied, knowing smile, she seemed to understand, finally, that her scheme had failed entirely. With a final, furious glance toward Elena, she turned and swept from the ballroom, her golden gown disappearing quickly into the night. The ballroom remained quiet for a moment longer, before Lord Hartley, ever the gracious host, raised his glass once more, a broad smile spreading across his face. "Well then," he said cheerfully, "shall we finally have that toast?" Laughter rippled through the crowd, breaking the remaining tension, and slowly, the ball resumed its earlier warmth, though Elena noticed, throughout the remainder of the evening, considerably more genuine curiosity and warmth directed her way than before, as though her honesty had earned her something far more valuable than society's easy approval, its genuine respect. Now, 3 days after that eventful evening, Elena stood once again in the gardens of Ashbourne House, though this time, the circumstances could not have been more different. The scandal Miss Prescott had hoped to create had, instead, transformed into something of a quiet triumph, society's gossip shifting rapidly from whispered accusations to genuine admiration for Elena's courage and honesty. Invitations continued arriving daily, though now filled with warm congratulations rather than curious suspicion. Julian had asked her, that very morning, to meet him in the garden at sunset, promising only that he had something important he wished to discuss. Elena walked slowly along the familiar garden path, past the fountain, where Julian had first confessed his growing feelings for her weeks earlier, her heart fluttering with quiet anticipation, as she considered what he might wish to say. She found him waiting near the same fountain, dressed simply, without the formal trappings of his usual public appearances, his dark eyes warm and unusually nervous as she approached. "You wished to speak with me?" Elena asked softly, moving to stand beside him. "I did," Julian said, though for a moment, he seemed uncharacteristically at a loss for words. Finally, he reached into his coat and withdrew a small velvet box, and Elena's breath caught immediately in her throat. "Elena," he said quietly, lowering himself onto one knee before her. "When my aunt first proposed this arrangement, I agreed, only out of necessity, believing it nothing more than a temporary, practical solution. I never anticipated that the woman brought into my life to solve one problem would instead solve a far greater one, the quiet loneliness I had carried since my father's passing, the fear that duty alone would define the whole of my existence." Elena felt tears gathering in her eyes, though she said nothing, allowing him to continue. "You have shown me, through your honesty, your resilience, and your quiet strength, exactly the kind of partner I wish to spend the remainder of my life beside," Julian continued, opening the small box to reveal a delicate ring, its single stone catching the last warm light of the setting sun. "Not a performance, Elena, not an arrangement born of necessity or convenience, but a genuine, heartfelt choice. Will you marry me? Truly, and for the rest of our lives?" Elena's tears spilled freely now, though she laughed softly through them, overwhelmed with a happiness she had never quite dared to imagine for herself. "Yes," she said, her voice trembling with joy. "Yes, Julian, I will marry you, truly." Julian rose immediately, sliding the ring gently onto her finger, before drawing her into a warm, tender embrace, and for a long, quiet moment, They simply stood together beneath the soft evening sky, the whole of their strange, unexpected journey finally settling into something real, something lasting. Nearby, hidden discreetly behind a hedge of roses, Lady Constance watched the scene unfold with unmistakable satisfaction, dabbing gently at her own eyes with a lace handkerchief. "Well," she murmured softly to herself, a proud, knowing smile spreading across her face. "It seems my little scheme worked out rather better than even I had planned." In the weeks that followed, Elena's transformation from a quiet, overlooked seamstress's assistant to the genuine, beloved fiancée of the Duke of Ashbourne became something of a celebrated story throughout London society. Not for the scandal Miss Prescott had hoped to create, but for the quiet courage and honesty with which Elena had faced every challenge placed before her. Lady Constance, delighted beyond measure by the success of her scheme, threw herself enthusiastically into planning the wedding, determined that it should be remembered as the finest celebration London had witnessed in years. Julian, for his part, found himself a changed man in the eyes of those who knew him best. Warmer, more open, the quiet burdens of his title now shared willingly with a woman he trusted completely, and Elena, standing beside him through every remaining preparation for their wedding, felt, for the first time since her parents' passing, that she had truly found a place where she belonged entirely, not through pretense or performance, but through the simple, powerful truth of who she genuinely was. On the morning of their wedding, as Elena stood once more before the tall mirror in her chamber, now dressed in a gown of her own careful design, she found herself remembering that rainy evening months earlier, when she had sat alone at a small table in the Golden Swan Inn, humiliated and afraid, certain that her life would remain forever defined by hardship and quiet struggle. She could never have imagined, on that lonely evening, that a stranger's whispered request, "Pretend you are my nephew's fiancée," would lead her here, to this moment, dressed in white, waiting to marry a man who had come to love her not despite her humble beginnings, but because of the strength and honesty those beginnings had given her. Outside her window, the morning sun rose bright and warm over the gardens of Ashbourne House, and Elena, smiling softly at her own reflection, understood at last that sometimes the most unexpected beginnings lead to the most beautiful endings of all.